accomplished so much. He built so many organizations, and yet he was so shy. And he was such a quiet, behind-the-scene guy.
George Hatch, media visionary, political activist, free speech advocate, environmental steward, father, grandfather. In 1995, he spoke of loved ones and business.
My family's always been more interested in news and creating programs.
Pennsylvania born, California educated, and 100 years after the pioneers, George Hatch was Utah bound with his beautiful wife, Jean.
A funny story that he and my mother had is when they first moved to Salt Lake, which was 1947, he said, you know, since I have $10,000 in the bank, I'm going to retire. And the joke was he never had $10,000 in his checking account. Millions in the company, but not that he was pulling out and putting in his own bank account.
Company rich and cash poor.
Right.
Jean's family owned the Ogden Standard-Examiner newspaper and KLO radio, where George went to work. Soon he started an Intermountain radio network with Call Radio as the flagship station. He convinced the Ogden Standard and Salt Lake Tribune to buy into KUTV. He grew the TV station, and with an array of microwave relay links, extended its reach to the Intermountain West.
And we thought if we connected a bunch of local stations through the Intermountain area, we could compete.
He started satellite news and partnered in a cable TV company.
I saw a fierce competitor who in many ways was a genius ahead of his time.
Pat Shea was general counsel for the Hatch Media Holdings.
There were many times where there were extremely controversial stories where people of substance in this community and throughout the country would call up to tell George that they didn't want something done, and George would look at the news director and say, "Is it true?" And they'd say yes, and he'd say, "Let's go ahead and run it."
And I remember cowering because there's George Hatch, you know, the big guy.
Phil Reeson, KUTV and Call Radio anchorman, remembers his first meeting with the boss.
When you finally approached him, were you surprised?
Yes. I was surprised at how welcoming he was, how warm he was, and I thought, that was no big deal. I should have approached him a long time ago.
Makes no difference where I go. You're the best place that I know.
KUTV's best-known promotional campaign highlighted Utah's beauty. But for George and Jean Hatch, preserving that beauty was more than a jingle.
Really did love Utah. They loved the possibility of Utah's wildlands, and they were very, very much committed to preserving the most beautiful portions of Utah.
The Hatches helped elevate Arches and Capitol Reef from national monuments to national parks. And they helped herd support for Antelope Island to become a state park.
Certainly environmental issues were very key to both he and my mother. And they really loved working together on those projects.
And what do you think he would say was his greatest accomplishment?
I think really his community activities and civic involvement would come out very quickly, particularly higher education. As chair of the Board of Regents, that was a really major role in his life. And, I mean, we had our share of arguments about how to run the company, so there were times when it was nice to have that phase in our life over with. But he really was a very thoughtful person and always had a way of looking at things that you'd miss if you didn't have the benefit of his input.
Who won those arguments?
Well, let's say both of us did at times.
The media empire George Hatch built is now divided. Observers attribute the deconstruction partly to George's decision to sell his cable interest rather than KUTV, because George Hatch wanted to stay connected to community. A daughter says he showed grace on the way up and on the way down, and George Hatch led softly.
Describe George Hatch for me. Describe yourself.
Well, I can't do that. You'll have to do that.